Hey class, today we're going to be doing 6.3 solving equations with rational coefficients. Now, it's the same thing as solving equations except for our coefficients are going to be rational, which are with decimals and fractions. So we kind of did it a little bit before, but in this case, how would we isolate this? This just means that it's being multiplied by 0.25 or 25 hundredths. So then that means we need to divide by 25 hundredths on both sides. In this case here, we have to do the inverse, right, of being multiplied by 3/4, which would be 4/3. So we would actually multiply both sides, by 4/3 on each side. Okay? And that would cancel out everything on the left. And I'm going to explain it a little bit on the next slides here. So, what are rational coefficients? Let's go ahead and get into that. So, remember that coefficients are the numbers that are attached to the variables. So, in this case, this 2x, the coefficient would just be the 2. Okay? Rational coefficients just mean they have fractions or decimals rather than the integers that we have been working on. And then last, multiply or divide using what you know as needed to isolate the variable. Okay, let's go on to our practice. So here is 6.4 equals 0.8m. Well, find the variable. What's happening to the variable? Being multiplied by 0.8m. So that means I'm going to divide by 0.8 on both sides. I would be left with just m on the right side. Now I have a decimal divided by a decimal. I don't like decimals, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of them by multiplying by 10 on both sides. So then I really just have 64 divided by 8. Now that's a whole lot easier, right? I can multiply by 10 over 10 because that's just 1, right? It's not going to change your problem. Now, so 64 divided by 8 equals m. You could also go ahead and do 6.4 divided by 0.8. And remember how they said, oh, let's move it over, this decimal over when you're dividing, right? And so you have to move that one over. Well, you have to move it over because what you're doing is you're multiplying by 10 over 10, really. So then you just have 64 divided by 8. All right, let's go on to this one. This one's a little bit more simple. So I have 1/2 x equals 8. Well, I have half of x. I want to get to a whole, right? How many halves do you need to get to a whole? 2. So we would multiply both sides by 2. In this case, I want you to multiply by the inverse. So you're going to multiply by 2 over 1. This is going to help for other fractions. So if I multiply the left side by 2 over 1, I have to multiply the right side by 2 over 1. And this is like 8 over 1 if you want to think of it that way. These would cancel out, so I'm left with x equals, and this is just 8 times 2, which is 16. So my solution is x equals 16. If I were to check these, that means to plug this in. So here's my check. I have 1/2 x equals 8. I put the 16 in there, and you can see that 1/2 of 16, is equal to 8. Okay, so 8 equals 8. Let's go on to the next problem. Okay, let's look at these two. I have negative 2.8 times p equals 4.2. What's happening to my variable? It's being multiplied by a negative 2.8. So I'm going to undo that or use the inverse. So I'm going to divide by negative 2.8 on both sides. This would cancel out. I'm left with b. Again, I have a decimal divided by a decimal. I can multiply by 10 over 10 to get rid of the decimal. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to multiply this by 10. Multiply this by 10. So I get 42 divided by negative 28. Well, I can't exactly solve this yet. I could simplify and divide this by 2 here, and 2 here. So then half of 40 is 20, and half of 2 is 21, or half of 2 is 1. And then half of 20 is 1, and half of 8 is 4. So I get 21 over 14. So what would P be? Well, how many times can 14 go into 21? I'm going to go ahead and write 21 over 14. So 14 goes into 21 one time. Subtract. So I have 7. And then bring down the 0. Or you can, actually I might keep it as a fraction. So I have 7 over 14, which is equal to 1 and 1/2, right? But this is a negative, so this would be equal to -1 and 1/2. So P equals -1 and 1/2. If you did it on a calculator, you would get -1.5, okay? All right, this one is a little bit simpler, so let's go ahead and do that one. So 3/4 x equals 9. Okay, we're going to multiply by the reciprocal on this, okay? It's kind of like dividing by 3/4, but when you divide by a fraction, you're actually multiplying by the reciprocal. So I'm going to multiply by 4/3 here, and I'm going to multiply by 4/3, okay? So this we cancel each other out, so I'm left with x equals 9 times 4/3. I'm going to cross cancel because 9 divided by 3 is just 3. So I can divide this by 3, which is 1, this by 3, which is 3. So now I just have 3 times 4, which is 12. So I get x equals 12. To check it, all I do is I plug it in. So I get 3/4 x equals 9. I put the 12 in here, so 3/4 times 12 equals 9. So what's 12 divided by 4? That's 3. So 3 times 3 is 9. So 9 equals 9. All right, let's do the next one. All right, this is our last problem. It's a word problem, so let's go ahead and read it. We have Valerie needs 2/3 yards of fabric to make each hat for the school play. Write and solve an equation to find out how many hats she can make with 6 yards of fabric. So hint is, how is the fabric being divided up? Well, I have 6 yards of fabric and I have 2/3, right? It's being divided up by 2/3. So let's talk about it. So if I have 2/3 of fabric, I want to figure out how many hats. So one hat makes 2/3, right? And then if she had 2 hats, I would have 2 2/3, right? And then, so I have to multiply by the number of hats, okay? And that would give me the total yards that I would need, right? So this is the amount of fabric I have for 1 hat, if this was 1. If I had 2 hats, it would give me the total for 2 hats, and so on and so forth. But we don't know how many hats we have. That's what we have to figure out. But we know that we have 6 yards. So in this case, we are going to solve this equation. So this is 2/3, so I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal, which is 3/2. So multiply by 3/2. So this cancels out, so I'm left with h on the left. And then 6, and I like to put 6, I like to cross cancel here. So 6 divided by 2, that's just 3. So 3 times 3 is 9. So I get h equals 9, and what does that mean? How many hats she can make. So Valerie can make 9 hats. All right, that is all for today for solving equations with coefficients that have rational numbers. All right, hope you guys are all doing well. Bye.